if a regime in Beijing that is as strong and powerful as we think it is worried about the actions of one very unimportant individual like me in London, that suggests that it's more insecure than we perhaps realize.
Welcome to Acton Line, a product of the Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty. I'm Eric Cohn, executive producer. June 4th marked the 34th anniversary of the Tiananmen Square Massacre, in which the Chinese Communist Party put down a pro-democracy protest movement that had bubbled up in Tiananmen Square and throughout mainland China. For many, it served as a stark reminder of the brutality of the country that, under the autocratic leadership of Mao Zedong, killed between 40 to 80 million of its own people, that it could still be just as brutal. Tiananmen happened just 3 years before Benedict Rogers moved to China to begin teaching English. For Rogers, this marked the beginning of a professional career focused on issues in and around China and Hong Kong, that saw him work as a journalist in Hong Kong for the first 5 years after the handover, to traveling to China's borders with Burma and North Korea to document the plight of refugees escaping from Beijing-backed satellite dictatorships, and then campaigning for human rights in China, especially for Uyghurs, Christians, and Falun Gong practitioners, human rights defenders, journalists and dissidents, and the people of Hong Kong. Rogers, who today runs the organization Hong Kong Watch, a watchdog organization which researches and monitors threats to Hong Kong's basic freedoms, the rule of law, and autonomy as promised under the one country, two systems principle, which is enshrined in the Basic Law and the Sino-British Joint Declaration, is the author of the new book, The China Nexus, 30 Years in and Around the Chinese Communist Party's Tyranny. In the book, Rogers takes the readers on a journey through some of the leaders and participants in human rights activities that China has suppressed since its inception in 1949. He goes on to dispute and lays to rest all of the specious claims by tyrants in Beijing that all Chinese citizens are equal and are afforded human and civil rights. Currently, the regime is engaged in re-education, cultural assimilation, and multiple genocides, leading to better citizens for China and the world if one believes Chinese officials. Today, I talk with Benedict Rogers about his book, China's history, its rise as a global power, its record on human rights, and what the future holds for the Chinese Communist Party and the people under its thumb. You can find additional resources in the show notes for this episode, as well as find previous episodes of Acton Line on our website at acton.org/actonline. And if you like this program, you can help us reach even more listeners by sharing it with a friend and leaving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. We welcome your comments as well. Acton Line is available on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. Benedict Rogers is the co-founder and chief executive of Hong Kong Watch. He launched Hong Kong Watch together with other co-founders in Speaker's House in the British Parliament on December 10, 2017, just 2 months after he was denied entry to Hong Kong on the orders of Beijing, and served as the chair of trustees of Hong Kong Watch from 2017 through 2020. Before joining Hong Kong Watch as the chief executive in September 2020, he was the East Asia team leader at the international human rights organization CSW, where he specialized in Myanmar, Indonesia, North Korea, and China. He is also the co-founder and deputy chair of the Conservative Party Human Rights Commission, a member of the advisory group of the Inter-Parliamentary Alliance on China, an advisor to the World Uyghur Congress, senior analyst for East Asia at CSW, a trustee of several other charities, author of 6 books, and a regular contributor to international media. He has testified in hearings in the British Parliament, European Parliament, Japanese Parliament, and United States Congress, and is a regular speaker around the world. Between 1997 and 2002, he lived and worked as a journalist in Hong Kong, and in 2003, he lived and worked in Washington, D.C. He is the author of the new book, The China Nexus, 30 Years in and Around the Chinese Communist Party's Tyranny, which we'll be discussing today. Benedict Rogers, welcome to Acton Line.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you.
So your book is The China Nexus, 30 Years in and Around the Chinese Communist Party's Tyranny. Why don't we start before you talk about your book, and I know that this is talked about in your book, talk about your background, your experience with China and how you came to be so involved in issues surrounding China in the modern world.
Yes, well, I first went to China when I was just 18 years old. I took a year off between high school and university, which is quite a common thing to do in the UK. But instead of going kind of backpacking or traveling around the world, I went specifically to China to teach English for 6 months in the city of Qingdao on the east coast of China. I had an absolutely wonderful time. I made a lot of friends there. And I always say when I talk about China today that contrary to what the Chinese regime would want you to believe, I am not at all anti-China. In fact, I'm very pro-China as a country, as a people. It's the Chinese Communist Party that I'm critical of. And my love for China goes back to that time when I was 18. I then traveled regularly for many years in and out of China. And I lived in Hong Kong for the first 5 years after the handover. It was my first job after university. So I really spent most of my adult life in and around China.
What brought you to teaching English in China? Where'd the inspiration for that come from?
The inspiration came essentially. I wanted to take this year off, but I wanted to do something constructive with it. I didn't want to just go traveling. And I wasn't initially sure where I might try to go. But my father came home from work one day, and he had a colleague whose daughter had done exactly what I went on to do and spent 6 months teaching English in China. And she had shared her experience and really recommended it. And I think what appealed particularly was my family was very well traveled. Both parents had traveled a lot in their lives. And I'd been privileged as a child to be taken to interesting parts of the world by my parents. But China was the one country that nobody in my family had been to. So there was a sense that it was, something new, something different, and a bit of an adventure, really.
What did you learn about China through that experience of actually being there, experiencing the people and the culture? Particularly, what stuck out and what surprised you about, I guess, whatever conceptions you had of China coming into that experience? And what surprised you with what you learned from living there and teaching English?
I think one of the things that surprised me was just how friendly and how eager to learn English people were, and how eager to not just learn English language, but read English literature and kind of get to know the outside world and the Western world. And I think that stems from so many decades of China being closed under Mao. And then it beginning to open up. I was there in 1992, so it had gone through a couple of decades of economic opening under Deng Xiaoping, but it was still at the time where it was beginning to open. So there was a real eagerness to learn about English language, culture, literature, history. But also a surprisingly high level of awareness, and a lot of the students had already very good English, and I think a lot of that may have changed now, because when I was there, it was there were signs that the country was opening up, not just economically, but perhaps to a limited extent politically. And I'm sure we'll go on to talk about this, but in the last 10 years, a lot of that has closed down, and it's become much more repressive than it was when I was there.
Tell us about your time in Hong Kong. You said you lived there right after the handover. What was that experience like? What was the feeling in Hong Kong after this handover happens during the time you were there? What was people's sense of it?
Well, I moved there in September 1997, so literally just 2 months after the handover. And I think there were a mix of feelings. There were certainly some people who were apprehensive, but there was a general sense that it was going to be okay, and that one country, two systems, the model on which Hong Kong was handed over, model that Deng Xiaoping had come up with and offered for Hong Kong, that would work. And certainly for the 5 years that I lived there, I think it was working. Hong Kong's freedoms during the time that I was there were pretty much intact. I'm sure there were problems beneath the surface, but they were small. And actually, the only form of censorship that I noticed towards the end of my time there was more self-censorship on the part of newspaper editors, rather than Beijing coming in the way it has done subsequently. So I think there was generally an optimistic feeling that that Hong Kong would continue to be Hong Kong, that it would succeed, and it would retain its freedoms. And sadly, that's proven not to be the case.
When did that start to change, or at least that as you noticed that change really started? So I should note as well that Benazin, the Acton Institute's documentary film, The Hong Konger, about Jimmy Lai's life, we talk about that transitional period in 1997 with the handover, and there's some evidence that China was beginning to back away from the agreement that it had made in 1997 pretty quickly, although certainly we've seen that accelerate in recent years. When did that change and the real dedicated moving away from the 1997 agreement, when did that really start?
Well, I started to see some very small early warning signs towards the end of my 5 years there. And I described this in the book, that I was working on a newspaper that was pretty outspoken, was ready to be critical of Beijing and of the Hong Kong government. And we were able to publish articles then that would be impossible to publish in Hong Kong today. But towards the end of my time there, I did start to see worrying signs. For example, the newspaper was bought by a tycoon who had business interests in mainland China, and he brought in a new editor and changed the whole tone of the newspaper. And that was one of the reasons I decided to leave, because I could see the direction it was going in. But I think the real key turning point was in 2014, when the Umbrella Movement, the first significant protests for democracy, happened, and the crackdown on those protests, and then a succession of events since then, and then obviously the dramatic crackdown was really against the protests in 2019 and the imposition of the national security law. But the turning point, as I say, subtle changes towards the end of the first 5 years after the handover that I could see myself. But the most serious turning point was 2014.
Let's back up to, again, when you're teaching English in China. So this is how close to after Tiananmen is this?
It's interesting. It was actually only 3 years after Tiananmen.
Was there any knowledge? Was there, how well recognized was what happened at Tiananmen Square? Was it ever talked about? What is because I've interviewed other people, of course, having to do with both the film and just for our podcast, and what I've been told, the sense that there's just no now institutional memory for the people of Tiananmen Square inside of China. That's essentially been wiped out by the Chinese Communist Party. At the time that you were there and experiencing it, was there any or a lot of knowledge of Tiananmen, and what was the sense of that?
Yes, there definitely was. And what was quite striking was that although people were very careful in public, and, in my classes, I had to avoid any political topics, in the privacy of people's homes, and I got invited to people's homes regularly for dinner, people would talk about it, and they knew very much what had happened, and they were, in some cases, very critical of the regime privately. But a lot of them said that they'd lost hope of any significant change under this Communist Party regime, and they said that if there were further protests, they would be met in exactly the same way. So there was a lot of disillusionment and real dislike and discontent with the regime.
So in 2017, as I'm reading here from about your book, on the orders of Beijing, you were denied entry into Hong Kong 20 years after having moved to the city and beginning your life as a journalist and an activist. So two things. First, tell us about your time as a journalist in Hong Kong, what you saw, what you covered, and then about the experience of being denied entry in 2017.
So when I was a journalist in Hong Kong, my first job was actually on a publication that was focused on China. So I was spending a lot of time traveling into mainland China. I managed to get one edition of that publication. It was a monthly business publication, but I managed to get one edition banned from mainland China because I'd done an interview with a very prominent labor rights activist called Han Dongfang, who had actually taken part in the Tiananmen protests in 1989. And he was, by this point, living in Hong Kong. And again, this illustrates that at the time, Hong Kong did have a high degree of autonomy because he was able to live in Hong Kong, continue his labor rights work. He ran a radio station where workers in China could call in with complaints. And he continued to do that. But I did this interview with him and ran it on the front cover of the magazine, and the censors in mainland China saw it, and it was banned. And more experienced journalists at the time said to me, every decent journalist should be banned once in their career, not too many times because then you can't function, but at least once as a sort of feather in your cap. I then moved on to a daily newspaper, which, as I said earlier, was a very pro-democracy, free-speaking, quite bold newspaper, English language. And I was the editorial writer, so I was writing the newspaper's opinions each day, as well as doing some features and columns. And that was quite wide-ranging. A lot of it was on Hong Kong politics, quite a bit on China, and other times it was on international, regional issues. In terms of my experience of being denied entry, I arrived, essentially I was, by October 2017, I was planning with others to establish an organization called Hong Kong Watch, but we hadn't publicly launched it yet. And I felt that before launching Hong Kong Watch, it was important to go to Hong Kong again. I had been back quite a few times after I'd left in 2002. But I felt it was important to go back to talk to people privately. I wasn't planning any public events or any media interviews. I was just going to meet old friends and a few new contacts. But somehow Beijing found out in advance that I was going, and I was stopped at the immigration counter when I handed my passport over. They put my name into the computer, and clearly it came up in flashing lights, and they took me aside and told me that they had orders from Beijing to deny me entry. They asked me a few questions. There was a slightly funny moment where they took me into a corridor behind the immigration counters in order to bring me into an office for questioning. And the office was locked. And they said, can you wait here in the corridor while we go and get the key? Now, obviously, I couldn't have gone anywhere. But what I was able to do was call a couple of key contacts, a very key political figure in the pro-democracy movement and the British consulate. So I was able to alert them. And then when I was actually put on the plane out of Hong Kong, I was also able to get a message to one of my contacts to alert the media. So by the time I landed, I actually was flown back to Bangkok because I'd flown in from Bangkok. And by the time I landed in Bangkok, the world's media had been informed, and I then spent many hours on the phone to different reporters. Then I flew back to London, and the BBC called me, and I was called into the BBC studios. The Foreign Secretary at the time, who was Boris Johnson, made a very strong statement. The incident was raised in both houses of the UK Parliament. And I always said to MPs and members of the House of Lords who were raising it in Parliament, it's great that you'll raise this, but don't make it about me. Make it about what this says about Hong Kong and where Hong Kong is going. So it did serve to put a spotlight on Hong Kong, and I think was an early warning sign of what has happened subsequently, which obviously is far, far worse than anything I experienced.
Yeah, I do want to come back to the reactions of political leaders, not just in the United Kingdom, but in the United States and elsewhere, to not just what has been happening in Hong Kong, but what just the growth and presence of China on a global stage. And I do want to get your thoughts on that. But I do, before we go there, want to cover a couple other topics. First, what was the inspiration for starting Hong Kong Watch? And tell us more about the organization and the mission of the organization.
Well, I had, up until 2014, I had not been following or speaking out on Hong Kong. I'd stayed in touch with friends, but I hadn't been politically active. But when I saw the umbrella movement in 2014, I knew that something significant was changing in Hong Kong. And I felt, as someone who had lived there, and I was already by this point working for another human rights organization called Christian Solidarity Worldwide, CSW, working on other issues in Asia. And so I felt, as someone who'd lived in Hong Kong and who was working in human rights, that I should speak up for Hong Kong. I was very struck in 2014 that how little attention Hong Kong was receiving and how few members of parliament or media organizations were talking about it. So initially, just as an individual, I started to do what I could, writing opinion pieces, talking to MPs. And then a number of prominent Hong Kong activists started coming to London. And one by one, they all contacted me to ask me if I would arrange meetings for them and host them, which I was glad to do. But I realized by 2017 that, first of all, it was unsustainable for me on my own in my spare time to do this. I felt we really needed an organization that could devote the resources and time to do this full time. But also, I felt that there was such a low level of awareness about what was happening in Hong Kong that, again, there was a need for an organization to raise awareness. So I came together with a few other people who were thinking along similar lines, and we founded Hong Kong Watch. Our initial mission was because at that point, one country, two systems had not completely gone. It was under pressure and it was being eroded, but it was still there in part. So our original mission was to generate international pressure to uphold one country, two systems and Hong Kong's freedoms. Of course, that mission has rather changed in the last 2 or 3 years, when it's become clear that one country, two systems has gone. China has completely broken its promises, and Hong Kong's freedoms have been totally dismantled. And so our mission now really is to keep the pressure up on Hong Kong through sanctions and other punitive measures, to keep the spotlight on political prisoners, and to help Hong Kongers who've come out of Hong Kong, either to the UK or to Canada, the US, Australia, to settle and to build their new lives. And particularly, we have a program of civic and political education to help Hong Kongers in the UK and Canada specifically know how to engage with our political systems and what their rights in their new homes are. And I would say that probably one of our biggest achievements was that very soon after we started Hong Kong Watch, in early 2018, we identified the BNO scheme as something that we should put pressure on the British government to act on, in order to provide a lifeline for Hong Kongers to get out of Hong Kong and come to the UK should they need to do so. And so we began really from 2018 advocating for that. And we were delighted when the British government, we were very sad that the circumstances meant this was necessary, but we were delighted that the government did act and has offered this pathway for hundreds of thousands of Hong Kongers to come to the UK. And I think it's fair to say that happened at least in part because of the groundwork that we did.
Yeah, a month or two ago, I interviewed for this podcast Winston Marshall, the former member of the band Mumford & Sons, who also does work with welcoming Hong Kong expats into the United Kingdom. And I think he made a very good point that I hadn't quite thought of in this way, that there's I think this is, I would say, largely true, and listeners can email me angrily if they disagree with me, at least from an American perspective, of kind of people coming from Hong Kong that has been viewed largely as this great center of business and finance. And there's just this within our imagination thinking, these people who are fleeing Hong Kong with the deprivations they're experiencing there now are coming with means, this kind of view of the Hong Kong businessman, I think, being the one who's that sticks in people's minds. And Winston made a good point about a lot of these people are younger, much younger, not particularly well off, not of means, and then all of a sudden being dropped into an entirely new country where they largely don't speak the language. And as he made the point, it's like, if you just got dropped into a different place like that, go open a bank account. Just the difficulty of being able to get enmeshed into a new country and a new culture like that, that kind of help is, of course, going to be incredibly important for people who are coming from such a different place.
Absolutely. That's very true. I mean, of course, there are many Hong Kongers who either do have means and are wealthy, speak English, and Hong Kongers in general are remarkably resilient and independent and entrepreneurial. But Winston is absolutely right that there are certainly many Hong Kongers who don't fit our sort of stereotype and don't have English, don't have much means, and they certainly need help. But even those who have wealth, culturally and in terms of finding a place to live, transferring their professional skills into a new job, finding schools for their kids, all of that requires support. So I think in the long term, Hong Kongers, whichever society they move to, whether it's the UK, Canada, the US, in the long term, they will settle and integrate very well, and they will be, in my view, a contributor to society. But in the short term, they all need some form of support and assistance and welcome.
As I've traveled with our film, The Hong Konger, for the last more than a year now, one of the standard lines that I've used in talking about at least the American view and the American experience vis-a-vis Hong Kong is that the United States, for both good reasons and bad reasons over the last about 8 years, has been a very inward-looking nation. We have been very focused on what is going on within the borders of the United States. And I would like to think that at a different time, we would have been as focused on what was going on in Hong Kong as we were to what was happening in Eastern Europe in the 1980s under Soviet domination. Talk about what is the level of attention to Hong Kong issues in the United Kingdom. I think we would probably both agree with both of our countries that we would like to see more attention paid there. But what is the level of attention and understanding of what is happening in Hong Kong in the United Kingdom right now?
Well, firstly, I would say that whilst I agree with you in regard to the United States overall, I think the US did respond in some ways better than the UK did at the time of the real crisis point in 2019 and 2020. And for example, the US imposed sanctions in response to what was happening in Hong Kong, which the UK did not. And both the former Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, and the current administration in those critical years, I would say did a lot. But the situation now, I think, in both our countries is it has fallen off the agenda. In part, that's because that always happens. The world moves on. There's a crisis point in one particular place. In Hong Kong's case, it was 2019, 2020. And then obviously now the world is focused on Ukraine and on Sudan and other issues. But I think it definitely has fallen down the agenda. I think in the UK, my concern is that the UK has, given our history with Hong Kong, and given that we are the co-signatory to an international treaty with China, the Sino-British Joint Declaration, and given that, for example, Jimmy Lai, who about whom you made the brilliant film, the Hong Konger, is a British citizen, the UK government is not doing nearly enough. It deserves credit for the BNO scheme, but it has not introduced any consequences for the Chinese government for what they've done in breaking that treaty with the UK. And so we're pushing hard for the UK to impose sanctions and to keep up the pressure. And I worry actually that the UK is reverting now. There are a few years where the relationship with China definitely cooled because of the Hong Kong situation and because of other issues in China. But I worry that the British government is trying to return to a sort of business as usual relationship. One of our trade ministers was recently in Hong Kong. It was the first ministerial visit in several years. And also the architect of the crackdown in Hong Kong, China's Vice President Han Zheng, attended the coronation of King Charles recently. Now, to be fair to the British government, they didn't invite him. They invited China, and China chose to send him. But I think the British government is not doing what it should be to keep up the pressure, to speak up for Jimmy Lai, to make it clear that there should be consequences for China's actions.
Why do you think the British government's response has been weaker than you would like it to be? Is it more to do with and I mean, we certainly see this in the United States here, the economic power of China? Does it have to do with, kind of the residue of issues connected to Hong Kong being a former part of the British Empire? Where does it come from?
I think it is primarily this sort of fixation with China's economic influence and the need to do business with China. And in my view, we should have learned the lessons of COVID. I thought we were learning the lessons when we had a big debate about Huawei's involvement in our 5G technology, and thankfully the right decision was made in the end on that, not to allow them in. But it appears that we haven't really learned all the lessons, and that we still want to pursue that business relationship. And I'm not someone who says we should do no business with China. I don't think that's realistic, but I think we should be de-risking, as I think is the new term to use, de-risking our relationship and diversifying our economic relationships around the world, and reducing dependency on China. But it doesn't appear that we're moving towards that.
I want to return to a couple of the topics you cover in your book, The China Nexus: human rights, genocide, and then one that was actually very surprising to me, that despite my immersion into China-related issues over the last 2 years and being a part of producing this documentary film about Jimmy Lai in Hong Kong, it was even very much news to me, was the organ harvesting program that goes on there. Why don't we first talk about China's human rights record? Lay that out for us. And of course, we can go back to the Cultural Revolution. We can go back to the millions of people who died at the hands of the Chinese Communist Party through the 1950s into the 60s and the 70s. But talk about it both historically and in terms of the modern Chinese state and their record on human rights.
Well, the Chinese Communist Party, of course, has always been repressive by nature and by instinct. And during Mao Zedong's rule, of course, China was much more closed to the rest of the world. And as you say, millions of people died as a result of his various both economic and political initiatives. What seemed to happen after, in the 80s before the Tiananmen Square massacre, and then even in the 90s and early 2000s after the Tiananmen Square massacre, was that the regime was willing to allow a certain amount of opening. Of course, there were always limits to that, and there were always red lines. But when I was there in the 90s and the first decade of the 2000s, there was a certain limited space, for example, for religious practice, for some degree of civil society. I remember meeting Chinese human rights lawyers who were actually able to take on cases within the Chinese judicial system. And they knew that they were under surveillance. They knew there were red lines that they couldn't cross. But within the space they had, they were actually able to do things. There was some degree of independent media and bloggers and so on. And then it seems that from about 2008, just after China had held the Beijing Olympics, at around that time, there was a movement that was known as Charter 08, led by the Nobel laureate Liu Xiaobo, who, of course, then was arrested and died in prison. I think that at that point, the regime got rather scared and perhaps thought that they had allowed too much space for dissent and decided to crack down. And so you saw a tightening in the years from 2008 onwards. And then Xi Jinping's rule, and he took over in 2012, really intensified that. And under Xi Jinping, all of that space pretty much has gone. So we're seeing now the worst persecution of Christians that we've seen really since the Cultural Revolution, including destruction of thousands of churches and crosses and portraits of Xi Jinping and other party leaders being put up in churches alongside religious symbols. We're seeing all those lawyers that I talked about, many of them have disappeared or been jailed or disbarred. And media is now totally state-controlled, and freedom of expression. I mean, if you say anything on any of the Chinese social media channels, WeChat and Weibo, anything critical of the party, it gets deleted instantly, and you're very likely to get arrested. So it is really the worst time now for human rights in many decades. And that sense that I had in the 90s and first decade of the 2000s that things were moving in a better direction has gone completely. And on top of so there's the repression of dissent and freedom of expression in mainland China itself, but then of course the continued atrocities in Tibet, which often gets forgotten these days, and what's increasingly recognized as a genocide of the Uyghurs. So it's an appalling human rights record.
Yeah, the genocide of the Uyghurs is probably, of course, the one that stands out the most. I mean, this really is a ethnic cleansing campaign against a Muslim minority population in part of China. So I guess I'll tie this to a question of, going back to what you were saying about the 1990s. There was this belief that the economic liberalization of China would lead in at least some way to some kind of a politic liberalization. That the theory was, if you're going to have that kind of economic liberalization, you're going to build a middle class, and that middle class is going to demand more rights within the political sphere. Certainly that is not what happened. So talk about a couple of things. Talk about a little bit more about the Uyghur Genocide, as well as, and I think we can tie this to the regime under Xi Jinping, who is, at least in my understanding of this, and correct me if you think I'm wrong, a departure from the direction that Chinese Communist Party leadership had been going prior to him. That, is it unfair for people to start making comparisons at least attitudinally and leadership style to Mao. Certainly the body count does not hold up, and that's one that we certainly hope we never have to make a comparison to ever again. But talk about both of those, the Uyghur Genocide, fill people in more on that, and then the leadership of China under Xi Jinping.
Absolutely. Well, perhaps I can start with Xi Jinping, and I'll come on to the genocide. I think the comparisons with Mao are certainly valid to a certain extent. First of all, he is by far the most ideological leader that there has been since Mao. His predecessors were all much more kind of technocrats, pragmatists, who, yes, were repressive, they were authoritarian, but they took a more pragmatic approach and were prepared to allow a certain space in order to pursue the economic growth and to pursue, I think, closer relations with the rest of the world. She has taken a much more repressive approach at home, but also a much more aggressive approach on the world stage, and has, I think, fractured and caused tensions in China's relations with other countries in a way that none of his predecessors did. But also, he's like Mao. He's brought back the cult of personality. None of his predecessors had that. Not even Deng Xiaoping, who was perhaps the closest in terms of being the sort of paramount leader. But even Deng Xiaoping didn't have a personality cult. Xi has pursued that. There's Xi Jinping thought has been added to the constitution. Pictures of Xi Jinping are displayed prominently in public spaces. And crucially, he's abolished term limits. From Deng Xiaoping onwards, the leaders had a term limit. They could serve 2 terms, 2 5-year terms. So Jiang Zemin and then Hu Jintao both had 10 years each, and then they retired. Xi Jinping has abolished term limits and theoretically could be leader for the rest of his life or for as long as he wants to be. So that's the comparisons with Mao. In terms of the Uyghur genocide, it has been recognized as a genocide both by the previous US administration and the current US administration, by several parliaments around the world, by an independent tribunal in the UK, chaired by one of the UK's top lawyers, Sir Geoffrey Nice. And even the United Nations hasn't recognized it as a genocide, but they have used the term crimes against humanity. And what's happened over the last 6 or 7 years or so is the establishment of a whole network of prison camps in the Xinjiang region where the Uyghurs are, with at least 1 million, and it may well be several million Uyghurs and other Muslim minorities incarcerated in these prison camps, subjected to forced labor, sexual violence, horrific forms of torture. But also, and this is where the term genocide is particularly relevant, there's been a campaign of forced sterilization and forced abortion against Uyghur women, a real assault on Uyghur culture, language, religion, Uyghur Muslims who do simple religious acts that any adherent of any religion would regard as perfectly normal, like reading their holy book, the Quran, praying and fasting during Ramadan, wearing a beard of a certain length. All of those things could and do result in them being thrown into these prison camps. So, and Uyghurs have been used as forced labor, not only in the prison camps, but actually transported around the country on trains to work in the factories of supply chains for global multinationals.
That is a point that I wish more people would dwell on. That I'm with you personally on that. It is both it's just impractical to think that we are going to get to a point where we are going to sever any and all economic ties with China. But I do desire for people to be conscious consumers and to understand the origin of some of the Chinese-made products that they may be purchasing, to at least be aware that there is a high likelihood or a decent likelihood that forced slave labor, likely of the Uyghur population, was utilized to make many of the things that may show up in their Amazon package on their doorstep.
That's absolutely right, and I think I think much greater consumer awareness is necessary. I do give the US a lot of credit for legislation that was passed over the last couple of years that does prohibit products made by forced labor from Xinjiang coming to the United States. As I understand it, it sets very high levels of proof for importers to be able to prove that products were not made by forced labor. So that's very welcome, and I wish other countries, including my own, would do the same. But consumers also have a responsibility to learn more, and as far as possible, it's not possible always, but as far as possible to check what they're buying and boycott anything that might have been made by forced labor.
Tell us about the organ harvesting programs.
Well, this is a really particularly shocking crime against humanity that the regime is committing. Essentially, they are targeting prisoners of conscience, and in particularly Falun Gong practitioners. Falun Gong is a spiritual practice derived from a school of Buddhism, and Falun Gong practitioners lead particularly healthy lives. They don't smoke, they don't drink, so their organs are very healthy. And the regime has been persecuting Falun Gong very severely for the last few decades, and they seem to have targeted them for the extraction of organs, which they then sell. And it's very hard. When I first heard about this awful abuse, I was somewhat skeptical because it sounds so shocking, and also because, unlike other human rights violations, it's much harder to prove because, by definition, the victim is dead. The witnesses are the doctors who've carried out the operation, and they're very unlikely to speak out. And the prison guards and police. So it's hard to prove, but the body of evidence has grown over the years. There was a very important report carried out by a former Canadian parliamentarian and government minister, David Kilgour, together with a Canadian lawyer, David Matus, and an American journalist, Ethan Gutman. And they compiled a lot of the evidence that existed. And they also carried out research by telephoning hospitals in China, which were advertising for organ transplants, and organ transplants for foreigners around the world. And so their researchers posed as interested potential patients and made inquiries with dozens of hospitals. And they found out that organs were available literally within a matter of weeks or even sometimes days, in a way that in your country or mine, we would normally wait quite some months before a matching organ could be found. In China, it can be found with remarkable speed. And they don't have a tradition of organ donation like we do. So the big question, given the number of transplant operations they're able to carry out, the speed that they can do them with, and the fact that they don't have a pool of donors, the big question is, where are these organs coming from? And China has not answered that question. And the evidence from those who have been able to get evidence out is that it's coming from forced organ harvesting. And most importantly, I mentioned Sir Geoffrey Nice earlier, who chaired the Uyghur Tribunal. In 2019, he chaired an inquiry into this issue of forced organ harvesting. And the key thing about him and the inquiry body was that it was made up of people who had no previous agenda with China. They were not human rights activists. They were not anti-China people. They were basically people who had no previous background with China, and therefore were able to look at this entirely independently. And they concluded, based on all the evidence they heard, that forced organ harvesting is happening on a systematic level, and that it amounts to a crime against humanity.
I want to close here with two final questions for you. The first, in your opinion, what is the stability of the regime, the Chinese Communist Party currently running China? I remember hearing an analogy from a China expert here in the States that I heard speak that made a comparison to think of it like marble. It's very strong, but it is brittle. There's no flexibility to it whatsoever. In your opinion, how stable is the Chinese Communist Party's regime in China?
I think it's less stable than it would like us to believe for a number of reasons. First of all, the sort of unspoken pact between the Chinese Communist Party and the people over the last few decades was that it would preside over an economic miracle that would result in dramatically improved living standards for people. And in return, the people would keep them in power and would not rise up against them. And part of that deal also was some limited amount of space that we've spoken about, without, with limitations. And that deal itself has been undermined by Xi Jinping because economic growth, the economic miracle, is not what it used to be. Xi Jinping seems to have an ideological vendetta against entrepreneurs, and a number of entrepreneurs have disappeared or been brought down. And he seems to be much more against private enterprise than previous Chinese leaders were. And he's, of course, become much more repressive. So that deal has gone, and therefore the question is, at what point will the Chinese people turn against the regime? We saw a hint of discontent in the end of last year in those protests against the very severe draconian COVID lockdown. And what was interesting in those protests was that the chant coming from some of the protesters was not lift the lockdown. It was Xi Jinping step down, CCP step down. And it's the first time I've heard that being chanted really since Tiananmen. So that's an indicator that there is discontent. I'm also hearing more discontent from Chinese students overseas, which we never used to hear. But I would also say that I think this is a regime that, by its own actions, shows that it is very insecure. It didn't need to crack down so totally on Hong Kong and completely destroy Hong Kong's freedoms and way of life in the way that it has. It didn't need to commit a genocide against the Uyghurs to exercise its control. And in a much more tiny and almost slightly humorous way, I've been the recipient of threatening letters from anonymous sources in China coming to my home address in London. Some of my neighbors, even my mother, has received letters telling her to tell me to stop doing what I'm doing. And if a regime in Beijing that is as strong and powerful as we think it is worried about the actions of one very unimportant individual like me in London, that suggests that it's more insecure than we perhaps realize.
I think that may dovetail well into my final question for you. What makes you hopeful about the future of China and the future of the world coexisting with China?
I think several things make me hopeful, although in the current circumstances, it's not easy to see hope. But I think we always have to hold on to hope for the long term. I think, firstly, history shows that dictators don't last forever, and we've seen change come at times and in places where we least expect it. We didn't see the fall of the Soviet Union or the fall of apartheid in South Africa. So I'm hopeful for that reason. I'm hopeful also because I believe the regime in Beijing is a regime fundamentally built on lies. And I think in the long term, truth always wins over lies, even if it doesn't feel like it at the moment. But I think fundamentally, the extraordinary courage of people in China, in Hong Kong, among the Tibetans and Uyghurs, who for so long have, and at great risk to themselves, have spoken out against the regime. And I think as long as we have people like Jimmy Lai, I mean, even if Jimmy Lai, as is likely, spends the rest of his life in jail, I think there are other people who will have similar courage, who will continue the fight.
Benedict Rogers is the co-founder and chief executive of Hong Kong Watch. He appears in the Acton Institute's documentary film, The Hong Konger, Jimmy Lai's Extraordinary Struggle for Freedom, which you can now stream on demand at freejimmylai.com. He is the author of the book, The China Nexus, 30 Years in and Around the Chinese Communist Party's Tyranny, which we've been discussing today. Ben, thanks so much for joining us today on Acton Line.
A great pleasure. Thanks for having me.
As always, thank you for listening. Our team loves putting this podcast together for you. It's encouraging to hear from our listeners. Feedback is incredibly important to us because it lets us know what you'd like to hear more of, including the kinds of topics you're interested in most. If you have comments, feedback, or ideas for a show topic or interesting guest, you can email our team at producer@acton.org. Until next week, for Acton Line, I'm Eric Cohn.